think it's time. Let's get started. So this is a DING research group meeting, decentralized internet infrastructure. And I think I participated in the last one. This is actually my second DINRG meeting. And we'll move on to the next one. Up front, we will have some front matters. Yeah. Mic is not on. To be on. Maybe this is better. Speakers can take off the mask temporarily, which is good. So as usual, we're gonna first go through a few NoteWell notifications. So this is IETF, follow the IETF intellectual property right. By participating in the IETF, you follow those processes and the policies, contributions. If it's covered by the patents, you need to inform the community and file such IPR disclosures in a timely manner. And IETF prefers the most liberal licensing terms. You can look at the RFC 5378 and 8179 for more details. Next slide. You can read as clearly as I could just read them myself, right? Personal information you provided to IETF will be handled in accordance with the privacy policies stated there. And as a participant or attendee, you agree to work respectively with other participants. And see the RFCs for the code of conduct. Next slide, please. Goal for IETF is focused on the longer term research issues, like this one. We're not really making standard, but looking to addressing, more long-term challenges. The IETF can publish informational experimental documents in the RFC series. We're not going to produce a standard making document. Next slide. So just Dirk and I are chairs of this group, and Dirk is remote online. I think people can see him there. This meeting note taker. So Dirk, I think we had one volunteer, or we still need to get one.
Yes, so kindly Raymond has volunteered. So Raymond, are you in the meeting? We got one.
What's the name? I lost. Or can we just get one more volunteers for note taking? Anyone?
Yeah, it looks like Raymond is not in the meeting, so I guess it's his first time.
We'll give 1 minute for everyone to think about whether you're willing to help. Interesting. So many people are interested in attending, but not. Yeah, okay. We got one volunteer. I couldn't see the name. Okay, let's move on.
That's great. Thanks. If you like, you could take notes in the HedgeDoc document. There's a link in the chat if you don't know where it is.
So this is just a recap of what happened at IETF Philadelphia, where we put a pointer there for whoever wants to refresh your memory. All the materials of that meeting are over there. I think essentially I gave a report on this workshop DINRG conducted in June 2021. And I think the two major points we extract out from that very interesting workshop is the following. That is, there's really two major factors, we believe, that have driven today's internet. Well, driven the internet from previously more or less, I would say, decentralized infrastructure into where we are today. It's largely centralized. I think one is economy of scale, that no one can deny that the cloud services really benefited from that factor. But we also believe from the workshop discussions that another factor is about equally played an equally important role in the internet centralization is the lacking of effective security solutions, and that have driven people into the clouds, so that with the thick walls of the castle, people somehow put their web services and other services into the clouds, because individually one doesn't really have the power to mitigate like the scale of and then the strength of today's deny of service attacks. Of course, this is just from the workshop discussions. Further discussions will be needed. And the next main point we took away from the last meeting is that that people, by and large, agreed we can use this DINRG as a forum to as a focal points to collect the future inputs and run discussions, so that it's more or less organized, better organized effort, as opposed to previously we have a long list of internet drafts around this area, this challenging topic, but scattered in different places as individual submissions. I think DINRG now would agree to be the host of those, the home for those discussions. Next slide. So moving forward, since the Philadelphia, we received multiple inputs, individual messages here and there, and also see in the global broader interest, broader community, that there's growing interest in addressing these challenges. So today we focus on this second task we collected from Philadelphia, that is beginning the very first kind of discussion. We have 5 presentations that covers a broad area looking at the centralization or mitigation of the centralization from different angles. We hope that today's discussion will really trigger the group all chip in, and therefore helping moving the effort forward. And then I hope we still have time at the end. We're going to discuss about the DINRG charter updates, given that the charter was written several years back. Now our understanding of the problem space have changed in a significant way. So by the end, Dirk will lead that discussion. We prepared that this discussion may not have enough time to finish. We only have 2 hours here. So we scheduled a set meeting on Wednesday. We know that not everyone would be able to make that time slot given this last minute the plug-in. But Dirk and I will try to draft something after today's discussion, so that we can conduct the conversation about the charter updates over email and continue onto the Wednesday. So that's the end of my 10 minutes. I think I'm right on time. And the very next one will be Mark, sitting right here. You can draw your own presentation.
Thank you. Let me bring the slides up here. Okay, let's see. I'm going to do it from here rather than stand up. So I have to sort of add to the contributions here. I've authored a draft based on the conversations that we had in Philadelphia and also in the workshop. Let me sort of bring up a little bit of context here. I think we know about the word taxonomy. This is not where I'm headed. Our understanding of taxonomy when we were learning in early school days is something that is a complex hierarchy of organizing information. That's really not where I'm headed here, but I wanted to remind you of the uses of that word. In my case, the word taxonomy is something that is actually suggested by the authors of the workshop report on centralization. They actually have a paragraph in the workshop report that basically talks about this issue. And let me put it into sort of very simple English here. If you have 4 people who are looking at a work of modern art, you have probably, they're seeing 4 different things, right? If you have 4 people taking a Rorschach test, they're going to tell you that there are different things in each one of them. And I believe that one of the things that we learned from Philadelphia is when you say the word centralization, it means different things to different people. It just rings a different bell. And that's without making any judgment about the validity of that interpretation or the applicability. I'm not being judgmental on that at all. I'm saying simply that when people hear the word centralization in the context of the internet, they think about different things. And when you think about the goals that the IETF has, I think that further work, and this work on the taxonomy is in support of further work on centralization would actually benefit from a look at particular facets of centralization, not trying to deal with it as a spread spectrum sort of topic, but instead thinking about specific work. And truly, this taxonomy document is in support of future work in the research group, right? I'll tell you at the very end that I have some other personal interests in this as well, but really the goal of this taxonomy is to support future work. If you remember where this, to tell you the context here, where this came from, is that the workshop report does have this a single paragraph that talks about the fact that there are different kinds of centralization. And in Philadelphia, for those people who were at the Philadelphia research group meeting, DINRG, there was a really robust discussion. And what was interesting was there were long mic lines and people talking about many different things. So the workshop report has this text in it, and I'm not going to read this text to you. Instead, I'm going to basically tell you that when Lucia talked to you about organizing the content of this session, many of the features of the workshop report were built into her presentation that you just saw 5 minutes ago. For instance, the first one is about the power of the economies of scale, right? And service customization, which we'll talk about in a second. And then the overall effect of monopoly players in the market, right? So this is text that's lifted from the workshop report, and it's part of the motivation for this taxonomy document. Now there is just this first version of the taxonomy, and it divides the topic into 4 areas. And this is where I'm going to spend my time here, the rest of my time on the agenda. So there is the concept of economic consolidation, right, and centralization. We hear a lot about that because it's market forces that make this happen. There's traffic and infrastructure consolidation. And if you've ever seen statistics here, like the statistics that Jeff produces, there's a lot of people who produce statistics about traffic, changes to traffic models in the public internet. There's a whole facet here related to traffic and infrastructure. And it has an interesting knock-on effect because it affects architectural consolidation, right? We see that the internet is provided in a different way than it was, say, 15 years ago. So not only do we have the nuts and bolts, the number of bits, where they go, how things are routed, how peering takes place, but we also have architectural components, especially the rise of intermediaries as an example. And then finally, we have service and application consolidation, right? A separate area where we see the application layer having more and more of a role, especially from dominant providers of those services and applications. And so the taxonomy breaks up the issue of centralization into these 4 topic areas, okay? And that's really the fundamental part of this taxonomy. Economic consolidation is something that we've talked about a lot. We talked about it in Philadelphia. There are some great papers in the workshop related to economic consolidation. And the centralization refers to the effects of market players, right? And the effects on competition and the economic power of a very small set of companies. And in the taxonomy document, one of the things we suggest is that there's 2 aspects to this. First, a small number of companies dominate the marketplace, right? And also that small number of companies dominate the flow of capital in the internet's economic ecosystem, right? 2 separate features, but both about economic consolidation and centralization. Sure.
I was wondering, so one thing I forgot to mention, for the time slot allocation, that's including discussion and the QA part. And therefore, everyone needs to be careful about
Okay. Okay, well, we could.
The question is whether you want to question in the middle or you want to question to the end.
I think at the end is what I would say here. So separate from economic centralization is the concept of traffic and infrastructure consolidation. What we're seeing is that a significant majority of the internet's public traffic is delivered from very, very large services. Okay, and someone in the room, in the workshop report, there are actual statistics provided for that. So there's actual data that drives that first bullet. And naturally, what these companies are trying to do is they're trying to provide the best possible service for their end customers because that drives the user base up and that builds the economy of scale. In today's internet, the result is really a flattening of the traditional topology of the internet. What we've got is a situation where the end-to-end principle isn't really the principle that's at work here, right? In fact, one of the things that was in the workshop report is this first sub-bullet here. A recent study shows that these large services reach more than 3/4 of the internet without having to do any transit of traditional ISPs, traditional large-scale ISPs. And another report that was done in February, right around the time or just before the Philadelphia meeting, was that the number of web pages hosted on large dominant companies has increased at a rate exceeding 80% on a year-by-year basis. That's enormous centralization. That's enormous consolidation. Now, the third of the 4 categories in the taxonomy is architectural consolidation. And in my paper, the draft suggests that there are really 2 pieces to this. One is the emergence of intermediary services, right? Services that are sitting either in the core of the network or provide services that look as if they're not being provided at the edges of the network. And then the movement of transport-related code to the application layer, right? Well, one of the things that we have are things like DNS over HTTP, right? Things like that where we're pushing up to the application layer, things that used to be provided by different layers in the network. Let me talk about both of these in turn. Intermediaries, technologies like CDNs are actually built into the network for very good reasons, right? Efficient delivery of services and content, lower latency for end users, the ability to, one of the things that's important about intermediaries is the ability to distribute the content very efficiently. And the end user is almost always unaware that the service or application that they're trying to take advantage of isn't what they're getting the service from, right? The key to this is moving the content and the service as close to the end user as possible. And what happens there is that, once again, the power of having a small number of providers and the economies of scale that go with that mean that there are a set of concerns related to consolidation and centralization associated with those intermediaries. The second of the two is the actual movement of services from, say, the transport layer up to the application layer. The application layer now providing those services specific for the application. I'll talk more about this in a second, but these are things that are very familiar to all of us in the room, I'm sure. The fourth bullet is the one that's important to me, is that now what happens is applications effectively are in a position to provide their entire ecosystem, almost a closed system, where they actually provide everything from the transport layer up the rest of the stack. The fourth and the final part of the taxonomy is service and application consolidation. This is the fourth this is my suggestion of a fourth layer for the taxonomy. It's the services and applications that the users see when they're actually interacting with the internet. And one of the things that was in an ISOC report that I think was from last year is this quote, and I think it's a very germane quote for this part of the taxonomy, is that what we have here is a very small number of companies operating some of the internet's most popular services. And many of those companies act as multi-sided markets. So they're actually working not just with the people who are transporting bits across the network, but they're also delivering services directly to the end user. And so that means that those services act as a base upon which other companies can build services on top of. And all that does is increase the power of that dominant organization. That's very different from an architectural consideration. This pushing the consolidation and centralization up to the application layer is a very, very important part of what we saw come out of the workshop and also the discussions we had in this research group in Philadelphia. Before I ask for questions, let me finish up. So the four areas, I had to have one graphic. The four areas in terms of consolidation and centralization that I'm talking about here are economic centralization, traffic and infrastructure centralization, architectural centralization, and service and application layer centralization. My goal with this taxonomy document is to get us to think about individual parts of this and talk about how, for instance, the IRTF can give guidance to the IETF about protocol design that addresses a particular issue. Now, maybe that's not possible, but here was my suggestion a year ago, is that what the IRTF could do is actually provide guidance to the IETF about, just as we provide security considerations or IANA considerations in an RFC, we might talk about centralization considerations, right? And the IRTF could possibly give guidance in that area. Just like RFC 3552 gives guidance regarding security considerations, so too you could imagine an informational document coming out of the IRTF that gave consolidation considerations. That was what was behind my interest in creating a taxonomy. So, setting up for questions here, what this is supposed to do is just guide future discussion of consolidation. It's currently a zero draft document, so I'm obviously looking for comments, suggestions. One of the comments that's perfectly appropriate here is that this isn't going to work. I would listen to that, although I might push back. Whether or not these four categories are accurate, is it a correct description of the kinds of inputs that we got for the workshop and the kinds of inputs we got from people at the microphone in Philadelphia? Have I accurately reflected that into these four groups? And then finally, it's my intention, as soon as I can after the London IETF, to turn around a revised version of the document and post that to the mailing list for further comments. And let me stop. Yeah. Let me stop and see if there are questions or comments.
I cannot see my laptop. Dirk, can you see who's on the line? Okay.
Yes,
So,
Andrew is in the queue.
Yes. Hi. Well, firstly, for what it's worth, I think that's a good reflection of the discussion as I understood it in Philadelphia. And then just made one comment on the document. You might want to just put perhaps in the economic piece something about the splinternet, because in my opinion, this is, if you like, a different aspect of the splinternet. Tell the people who you are. Oh, sorry. As it says on the screen, Andrew Camping. Sorry, that's the point of the mic cue. Anyway, as I was saying, there's a whole splinternet aspect here, and I think this is another aspect of the splinternet, not the one that people traditionally talk about, but arguably this is far more important to users than the sort of the political splinternet, because this is actually real now, rather than something which is perhaps a threat for the future.
Okay, thanks. Jim, name and affiliation.
Jim Reed, no affiliation. I work for myself. And I don't know what I'm doing here. Mark, I think you've done a very great job of summarising the discussions and how we've got to where we are here just now. So kudos for that. And I think the initial content of the draft is a reasonable reflection of where we are at the moment. It might need a little bit of tweaking further on, but I do think this is an important topic, and it's something that this research group could explore further. As you see, I think there's a potential challenge later on about how that research work can then feed into the rest of the IETF. That'll be an interesting discussion to have maybe further down the line, but I think it's very important that we start talking about this, and it seems to be at the moment this is the only forum we've got in the IETF to do that. So I would hope everybody else in this group, either in the room or abroad, and that's following this online, will support the work and encourage taking it forward, because it has to be done. And if it's not going to be done here, it's not going to be done at all. And that's a big problem.
All right, thanks, Jim. Dirk, you're next.
Yes, yeah, thanks, Mark, for putting this together. I just wanted to challenge a little bit this notion of these centralization considerations that you mentioned. So in my experience, quite often it's really not easy to tell the effect of certain protocol or protocol features with respect to centralization. So I was wondering whether you had some further thoughts on this already.
I think, well, I do, and they're just my thoughts, Dirk, and they're not sanitized for the office. The first example that I'll give you is an example like Privacy Pass, which is under development right now, which is an example of a protocol that by design has a very small number of, it's a token-based system to provide privacy for end users and yet allow for authentication at servers, et cetera. But by design, the architecture limits the number of token granting servers. And so the protocol by design does that. And I for myself, I look at the services that we are developing in the IETF that have intermediary components, like the oblivious HTTP as an example, right? Where you have something in the middle between the requester and the provider of services. And I think in those cases, what I worry about is the quantity or the consolidation of those services in the middle. That's a concern of mine. So that would be the example I would pitch to you.
Okay, great, thanks. I could imagine this characterization could be quite controversial at times, but yeah, let's think about this further. Thank you.
I'd be very happy to hear antagonistic comments in addition. So that would be just fine. Arnaud, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So Arnaud Tadei from Broadcom. So thank you for putting this work together. In fact, so it's a support to this work. It's just, have you considered other aspects of consolidation like overall resilience? So what happens when we have a major problem with one of these consolidated actors? We have a number of examples in the past that seems to be minimized, but they are not in terms of when it fails, what happens. Another one is trust. So what is it, the trustworthiness that we have in these consolidated actors. And another one, which is perhaps more difficult to approach, is probably the current gravitation of regionalization in the world that is going against consolidation, regardless if they want it or not. So there are three aspects here that might be considered by the draft, but in general, we support this draft. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. And I'll cut the queue after Colin here.
Hi, Colin Perkins, University of Glasgow. So I think this is really nice work. I think it's really good to try and be a little bit systematic on the things driving consolidation and centralization. Were there any things that were identified as explicitly not driving centralization? And should the draft be thinking about that, or is that a different piece of work?
Well, that's a great question, and you'll not be surprised to hear that I don't have a good answer for that. I think the draft should consider that, but that feels like a separate piece of work.
Awesome.
What you'd eventually like out of this piece of work, the taxonomy, is sort of a narrowing of scope for certain kinds of research. So that the research group is productive in the future by focusing on, for instance, architectural principles as an example, right? Or focusing perhaps on the changes at the application layer. But what you suggest is something that the draft probably should at least think about. And if the authors of the draft think that it's appropriate to do a separate document, we'll talk to them about.
Yeah, it may not be the same document.
Right.
It may be a different issue. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Many thanks to everyone.
I will insert myself at the last, because I cannot get into my laptop. I would like to second Colin's comments. This is really a great contribution. I think it's so much material. Let's open up the discussion on this topic. Two specific comments. One is that you mentioned about the architectural centralization and use the CDN as an example. My question is the CDN architectural components, or is it actually independent from the protocol stack of the architecture, but just overlay to, I would say, achieve the functions that the protocol stack didn't provide? That's a scalable content dissemination. And today is that DDoS mitigation, which I think both are the deficit of the VIP architecture. Yeah. The second question I'd just like to bring up for discussion, like you mentioned in your draft, that economy of scale is a fundamental factor that got us to where we are today. Now the question is whether we can just develop technical solutions alone to actually mitigating this fundamental economical problem. That's just bring up the question for people to think about. Thank you very much.
Well, let me respond to your first question. The second question about economics is something where I feel like I'm on shaky ground, and so I would be thrilled if people provided comments on the mailing list about the economics part. In terms of the architectural considerations, I do see CDNs as an example of an architectural change to the internet. And the way I think about it is the historic view of the end-to-end principle is really no longer in play. We're asking the core and the edges of the network to do much more than they used to do. I think that's an architectural change. And I think we don't, I think that there are many times where we don't acknowledge that. And I see there's disagreement. and I can't wait to talk to you about it. So that's great. I'm happy to hear input, and I look forward to it this week if you're going to be around.
I would just say that to keep the schedule, I will save my comments and send to the mailing list. But I think it's a great question to bring up. That is, what is the end-to-end principle? As the world changes, does the definition also change? Okay. Right. There used to be end-to-end is end-to-end reliability, and that's no longer there. Even with the mobile, there's no end-to-end connectivity. But Yeah, I'll leave that to the.
Well, we've
then
taken,
there's a discussion.
we've taken our 20 minutes, but I look forward to having conversations with you in the hall and also online on the mailing list. So Dominique, you're up.
So you want to help with ballot? Okay, if I take them. Oh, of course. Okay. Yes, I will.
I'll just tell me when to.
Okay, thanks. So thank you, Mark. And Mark's, long before Mark's excellent work, we co-authored this particular draft, which actually addresses the end-to-end principle, addresses what a little bit to a short extent, also addresses some of the threat analysis. I think Arnaud brought it up. So hopefully I'll answer your question, Arnaud, a little bit as well. So can I have the next slide? Thank you. Right, so here we are in version 5. So we started this this originally in November 2020, and in the last version, in the current version, one thing that we did is, or in particular I did, is actually really narrow it down because of your taxonomy. And I've referenced a little bit more of Mark's excellent work in terms of really getting a broader view. So basically this particular draft is kind of looking at the current state at a higher level than Mark goes into. But the other thing it does is talk about maybe potential outcomes or options or ideas for going forward. It also talks about a little bit some of the risks. So I'll get into that a little bit in depth, but I'm not going to take too much time. Thanks. So yeah, so as Mark said in his taxonomy draft, you know, there's a wide variety of different views. There's even different definitions, right? Some people are using the word consolidation, some are using centralization. I'm finding we're interchanging it a lot, but we really need to kind of think about linguistically what we're looking at, and there's a couple of definitions in there as well. I have a bit more background in economics. So we look a little bit more of the positive, I would say, aspects of consolidation, the economies of scale, the ability to build data centers and have investments at a very big and grand scale. But then conversely, a lack of market competition in some areas, in some places, depending on the layer and the platform and whatever else. And we originally, Mark and I originally looked at that based on a report that was done in the US, was done in Congress. And, you know, that's going back to 2.5 years now, I think. And that was sort of some of the interest of the economic background. In terms of security, end-to-end encryption forces data to the endpoints. There's a little bit more I'll show in the next slide or next couple of slides on that idea and on that concept. And again, picking up probably earlier than Mark, talking a bit about consolidation through development choices, architectural choices, and protocol development choices. So next slide. Right. So we talked a bit, or Mark talked a bit about this, the changing architecture of the internet. And I think that choices, you know, people make obviously have effects, architectural and engineering effects. And in my personal interest, I'm also interested in the wider effects, the economic effects, the policy effects, the effects that actually make users make different choices. So we talk quite a bit about that in this draft. And also, I think it would be worth it to have even more discussion about it, but the end-to-end principle that Alexia brought up, the reliability and the trustworthiness, and you know, it's moving from end to end to edge. And I really like your questions, Alexia, because I think in the next draft I'm going to probably look at that a bit more, right? You know, do we need to think about defining this a bit differently? Briefly talked about network and devices as consolidators as well, a little bit with the upcoming 5G, network slicing, things like that. And one thing on the edge to edge is something that I think Russ was talking about through his his GitHub post and everything about the sort of protocols not being doing one thing, but being the be all and end all of all things. So the idea that protocol development in some cases, not all cases, have quite a number of activities and characteristics that they take on, that's taken on when they're deployed. Thank you. So risks, hopefully this is something that is touched upon briefly by two examples. But again, decentralized to centralization, decreased stability and fragility, thinking about in terms of another draft that I have on threat models, right? And thinking about what's happening in terms of more recent attacks and how they're being executed, not always successfully. So the redundancy issue around the idea of the decentralized internet and redundancy when you have fewer providers. And we've seen that obviously with a number of issues, like when WhatsApp went down last week, you know, everybody freaks out. But yeah, that's basically what we're trying to capture in a more technical sense. And also threat visibility and diversity. So one more. I think this is the last slide. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have a place for this now through all of you. And so just thinking about some of the options coming up, what do we look further at? I like the idea that Colin mentioned about what isn't, consolidation as a work item or as a potential draft, but also focusing on more measurement in different areas. But what else? What else can we continue the discussions on? And here I have a couple of proposals that were in some earlier drafts that we did, but measurement, consideration of consolidation in RFCs, should it be its own section? Should it potentially be reviewed by people or as an item that people review? Who knows? But just throwing out some ideas, and human rights review as well, something that I think would be interesting to discover and talk about. So any further thoughts is welcome. Happy to take it offline. And again, it's going a bit more hand in hand with your work too. So I think that's it. Next slide. Yep, that's it.
So any comments or questions for Dominique?
So we have.
Thank you
Britta
for the nice
Hill in-
summary. That was great. I have a question regarding your work on the end-to-end. There's another draft in progress with Mallory Nuttall and yet another one with Alec Moffat. And both of those drafts address basically a conceptual flaw in how we have been looking at end-to-end and how that has been propagated. I like sort of the term edge-to-edge that you're working with here. But there's also catches with adding yet more vocabulary to a space that has holes in it already. I'm wondering how you are defining that difference or how you're working with those other drafts to consolidate this.
That's a really good idea. So one of the things, and I don't know if Mallory's here in the room. Yay. So can I catch up with you this week? Because I would love to do that. I know Alec really well, but I haven't read his draft yet. So I think, again, the economies of scale would make more sense, but maybe we need to talk more about the definition of it. But thank you. Actually, that's a really good point that I need to kind of think more about that. So to answer your question directly, we haven't worked together, but we know each other well. So I think that's a good place to start. So thank you for that.
Okay,
yeah.
great. There's
Thank
also
you.
a white paper out about that that's using both those drafts. So
Oh,
just to know that there's a whole branch of work on that.
I'm a little
sector.
annoyed with Alec. Didn't tell me. Anyway, I have to leave.
Hello, Roland Bliss. Just a quick comment on end-to-end. That is quite fuzzy term. So there is the end-to-end argument system design. There is end-to-end transparency. There's end-to-end encryption. And what are the ends actually depends on which layer you are talking about. Is it the network layer, is it the transport layer, or the application layer? And this is all, at least from my point of view, mixed up somehow. So we need to really define things concisely and precisely.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I would just add one more comment regarding end-to-end. People think end-to-end is facing challenges. Clearly, that means there's something in the middle that interrupted this end-to-end something. And therefore, what are these things in the middle and why they showed up in the middle? Actually, I coined the word middle box. That's really started, I think, 30 years back, almost, that we started seeing something pop up in the middle. And that middle thing just grow wider and wider. So I think it's a big question to ask, why? why the internet started without the middle boxes, and now we depend on middle boxes. Yeah. Just to add to the discussion.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So we have the third presentation now. We're actually roughly back to schedule.
Sorry?
We're back to schedule.
Yes, hello. Thank you. Yeah, you can skip the slide. It's about web centralization. My name is Jens Winkhäuser. Dirk invited me here. He said that the talk I gave at FOSDEM earlier this year was something I should repeat here. So that's what I'm doing, but much shorter. I have a small, tiny nonprofit that tries to do a bit of R&D in internet technology. And this talk is more about how we got into the Internet Society Foundation grant to work on solutions, potential solutions. Thank you. So when I say web centralization, the way I talk about this, I usually divide the room. And what I want to say is I want to start out with a bit of context here first. And I'm not sure whether this picture that I've picked there is actually accurate for my illustration here, but I want to show you basically an easy path and a difficult path to the same goal, right? And with the web, I get the impression that the easy path leads somewhere we don't want to be. Thank you. Next slide. Sorry. This is about decentralized network infrastructure. I tend to talk about distributed a lot more. I'm sure all of you have seen this diagram. I just want to basically bring it up because if I talk about distribution, that's what I'm talking about. This one here, no, the rightmost type of architecture. My view here is, and this is why I wanted to bring this up, is that this kind of distributed network doesn't really work well with the client server paradigm. And I'm going to go into this very briefly later on. Thank you. I don't have to tell you what the web is, what REST is, but it's kind of important to point out once in a while that REST and RESTful is not the same thing. We can have a long discussion about this outside. But there is something about RESTful that tries to map HTTP methods to CRUD style operations. And that is actually an important part in what I want to talk about here. Thank you. This is the diagram from the REST dissertation. All what you have to understand here is basically that from the user agent that's on the left-hand side, all the three paths lead through the same interface. And we don't need to know at all what's going to happen on the right-hand side, how the service is provided. This is essentially the core of REST, that we have an abstract interface for all of this. Thank you. Yeah, this is just the same thing in text for people who read the slides. Thank you. So web centralization. I'm a bit concerned that because HTTP pre-assigns the client server roles, that means it's impossible for each node that's in an HTTP environment to route around failures because they're already either waiting for something to happen if they're a server, or they're trying to reach something that doesn't happen if they're a client. So the whole idea of resiliency there doesn't really work well with the client server model. And I think this contributes to why the web pushes towards centralization. The other aspect there that I see is that authentication is centralized on the web. Centralized not in the sense that the entire internet is authenticated in the same place, but in a service at least. And that means that the endpoint decides also how data may or may not be accessed. And I already mentioned that this RESTful approach that maps CRUD style operations to HTTP methods is technically not how REST was meant, but it has a point. Thank you. And that is that we have actually, and this is right, kind of the core of what I want to point out, we have a natural mapping of these methods. I think this is why this has become so popular. We have a natural mapping of these operations to most of the HTTP methods, except for update. And one of the things that I realized when I read the REST dissertation again is that actually it says there that the whole point of code transfer is optional. Now code transfer is optional. back then we were talking about Java, not JavaScript, but nowadays it's JavaScript. But if you have a client that is supposed to be generic, which is what HTTP is all about, and it can read any resource, it can delete any resource, it can create any resource. If it can't update it without getting instructions from the server how to do so, then those instructions, that code and the data become an tangled mess that you can't take apart anymore. And this is what puts control over the data with the server. Thank you. And then I can only briefly repeat what people have been saying before, basically. There are economic incentives for continuing with this, right? I don't need to read through this, but except that you know, the natural fit of gathering all this data is surveillance capitalism, which is a problem nowadays. So maybe we have to work against this somehow. So again, I'm coming back to this picture because centralization isn't really required by the web, right? Nothing in the web requires centralizations, but I feel like on a technological level, the incentives are already stacked towards centralization. So the question for me and for us, I think I understand why Dirk invites me to this group, is how can we maybe make decisions that push into the opposite direction? Thank you. So from my point of view, and I'd love to hear a lot about this from you guys, you know more about this than me, is that we already have solved some of the authentication authorization. Authentication is solved in quotes because, you know, there's tons to do. It's just the principle is sound. We have something like public key cryptography. We can authenticate people without needing a third party in the middle. Authorization is harder. I'm working on something based on capabilities. There's going to be a talk about power of attorney, which I don't know, but I read as being something similar. I'm very interested in the talk. So I think there are ways we can move forward with approaches that don't require any central components in a web architecture, web-based architecture, or in any web-like architecture for these parts of authentication and authorization. Next slide, thank you. And then the other part is how to disentangle this mess of data and operations being controlled entirely by servers. And well, from my point of view, we have to make the data representation. That's the core part here of REST, know that the data is representational, and that is what drives the fact that the service can control how to modify it. We have to make this an end-to-end problem, or client-to-client problem, right? It should not be a client-to-server problem at all. And if we just default to end-to-end encryption, then that takes the service out of the process. We have data routers instead of services, which has other side effects. We have to talk about those at some point. And that also means that we don't really need all these CRUD-style operations anymore, because basically this is also an end-to-end problem at that point. And then we don't need much of the web anymore, which is not something people like to hear. And what I see a natural fit for this is information-centric networking, which is another group that Dirk invited me to, probably because of this. Thank you. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions? I was rushing through that.
I'm Rick van Rijn. I'm responding on your remark that the web is centralizing usernames. As far as I can tell by tracing back, what seems to have happened is that in HTTP, the user add part has been used as a client identity, whereas the rest is a server identity. And what I think we should move towards with HTTP is to have a client URI and a server URI. And if you use a user in the server side, it should mean a resource reference. So like a homepage, for example. And that might be the same, but it has become merged together. It's become fused together. And I've tried to I've tried to have this discussion in the HTTP group, but I won't let go of this fusing.
No.
But I think this is one of the reasons that we ended up pushing all our passwords and all our usernames into every individual web server.
It's quite possible. Thank you.
Hi, Colin Perkins. I fear I may be jumping the queue. Apologies. You say that client server sort of opposes decentralization.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree, but we seem to have very distributed servers.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's, so it's opposing decentralization in one way, yet we can build massive scale, largely distributed servers. So there's clearly a middle ground somewhere.
There is clearly a middle ground, yes. I mean, that's why I mentioned this or brought up this diagram about distribution. I'm talking about the resilience of distribution, really. In a decentralized system, I don't see that as that big of a problem.
You don't?
I don't see that as that big of a problem in a decentralized system. In distributed, it's more of a problem. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, hi Jens, this is Dirk. Thanks for bringing your work here. So maybe could you maybe explain once more, so what is in your view the problem of using post for updates, and what are the, say, negative consequences that are stemming from that, and how would a better update protocol look like?
Sorry, I probably rushed through this a little bit. The problem with using post is not post in itself. It's that the REST architecture makes a claim of having a generic client, and the generic client is basically what enables using, in this case, HTTP as an abstract interface to anything, right? And that enables the scale at which the web grows. So it's a very, very fundamental feature of how we got to where we are today, in my opinion. But if you look at how actually any update request to a web service is being made, you don't have the standardized HTTP form data anymore, right? Multi-platform data anymore. Nobody uses this anymore except for very small use cases. What happens almost exclusively is that the server sends some data, some code around to the client, which the client executes to form a request that creates the specific representation that the server requires. And that brings control over updating and therefore also over the data completely to the server side. Does that make more sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, makes sense.
Thanks. I'm going to close the queue here.
Okay.
And I'm going to take the microphone in the room next. Then I'm going to go to Lixia, and then I'll go to Wolfgang. So please.
Stefan Bartsmeyer. Your point about authentication is a good opportunity to remind everyone that the driving forces to centralization are not only economic or technical. There is also a problem with the users. Some users, maybe most users, don't want to face the internet directly. They want some sort of intermediary between them and the internet. For instance, for authentication, it's a good example because managing your own private key is hard. It's a really hard problem. So decentralized authentication through public key cryptography can be quite dangerous. That was experienced by many blockchain users, for instance. So this is typically a case where it makes sense for user to defer to some intermediaries, maybe not a big centralized intermediary, but at least some level of intermediation.
I don't even disagree with this. I consider this a user experience issue, right? What I find interesting in the context of this, and this is just an observation, is that in Germany, when you want to submit your taxes electronically, you actually have to handle private keys, public keys, and somehow it hasn't stopped people from doing so. So I think it is workable.
Yeah, but there is probably a backup if you lose your private key, for instance. There is certainly a solution to get a new one, unlike, for instance, some solutions like blockchains, for instance.
Yes.
Okay, so I have Lixia next, then Wolfgang, then Arno.
The first thing I want to say is that I'm so glad to see that we have DINRG as a platform for all the conversations. I think today's talk, which every one of them brought up different views, different perspective. after this meeting, I think we're going to have lots of discussions on the mailing list. But for specific questions, this point that a client server somehow facilitated this centralization, I just want to point out when web first occurred in the early 90s, we didn't have a centralization problem for many years. I think centralization became an issue only in the last, I think, less than 10 years. It's ever increasingly become an issue. So therefore, there's a question whether it's really the protocol design as a major factor, or it's some other major factor that actually has been driving the centralization.
I think, sorry, should I answer this?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a bit like the nature versus nurture debate, right? You have to have both factors in order to, several factors in order to come to a certain point. And the protocol design certainly contributes. I'm not sure, and that's my opinion, of course, right? I'm not sure whether it's the sole cause. I think what happened here is that the protocol design was sort of a little bit oblivious to how the economies of scale would work back when it was done. I don't know, I wasn't part of this, right? So this is my take from nowadays. And then the economies of scale came in and decided to exploit this.
I think I hold a proposition that the protocol designs, it's a question whether protocol design decides distributed or centralized. Take a DNS services as example. Many years as it was fully distributed. It's only in the recent years that became so centralized, and the protocol hasn't changed. Another example, mail services. Many years, the individual organizations ran their own mail servers, and SMTP has not changed, but the email services got by and large centralized. So this opens the question whether we actually can change the protocol design as a way to mitigate centralization. But more specifically to your question with regarding to the client, adding a client URL into the HTTP, that brought up two questions. The first is, what is the identity for clients? Do you have a DNS name? I don't. I'm pretty sure most of the people in this room do not. What would be the identity for the clients so that you can attach a key to it, right? Key wouldn't work without identity, or unless you use the public key alone as its identity. But that is totally, I mean, how you authenticate individual keys without meaningful identity space.
I understand, yeah.
Yeah, and the last question, or comment, you mentioned that we have distributed authentication problem solved.
Solved, yes.
I think authentication actually is the easy part. Again, this goes back to the hard question, how you get the public key in the authentic way, right? It's a trust question.
It's a trust question,
and
yes.
So how you decide the trustworthiness of a key. Today, we have the servers authenticated because we have the certificate authorities. Do you have in mind that everyone get a certificate from the CAs? Or we actually need a fundamentally different trust management system?
It's a great question. I don't have an answer to this. I have a thought about this, and this goes back to what other people have done. It's not based on me. I think the number of contexts in which we have to have authentication irrevocably prove something about a person is actually very, very much smaller than we tend to assume. There is another approach to doing this, which is usually called a pet name system, which I quite like, is that if I receive a public key from any of you and you tell me that it's Bob, then to me that is Bob, because that's what I'm being told. And I can base my trust level on how much I trust Bob or the person who sends me this key, which is very much like the web of trust, except you can do better than the web of trust, I think. And I think for very, very many contexts, this is more than sufficient. It's clearly not going to work for everything.
Okay, thank you for being patient, Wolfgang. You're next.
Okay, we really must distinguish between technological centralization and economical centralization, because Google doesn't run one big web server. It has a decentralized architecture, I guess. If we can solve the economical centralization problem, I doubt that very much. Well, that's my point.
No, I don't think we can solve the economical problem at all. We can make it maybe a little bit harder to exploit it massively.
Okay, Arnaud?
Yeah, so thank you. In fact, there was a lot of good points in the previous interventions. So I would like to start 30 years ago, when I started my career, I arrived at a place called CERN. And when I opened my office, in the office in front of mine was a certain Tim Berners-Lee. So I had the chance to witness what happened, and I promise you that Tim would be in this room, he would hate what this world has become today. So from a layer 7, we are now moved to a layer 8, because some parties understood, oh, we can evade regulatory scrutiny by creating something which is outside, and now we have a layer 9. So the issue, in fact, they started to recognize is that we are technologists, so we like to speak about protocols. But in the way you present it, it's about protocol design. And I think we forget the other term, which is design. The problem we face is that when we create technology on something where there is zero anthropology what we are doing. That means we create something and, well, let's see what happens. Let's see how people adopt it. But it's not like in other areas like civil engineering. Civil engineering, which actually is rather recent, but when you trace that down to what a bridge is, what the experience of a road, of a building or something, it's 1,000 years ago. We have many anthropologies of that. So when we do things here is from what we do, we don't understand that from the technology possibilities might infer many legislative possibilities, that might infer many ethics possibilities, that will end up with anthropologies. It's just that unfortunately for us, some people were faster to understand that design piece and understood what is it that we have in this tree to optimize our game. And they fixed that, and some parties here wrote about that it created a very narrow model of the human being. So back to the previous speaker in front here about the user experience, I think when we design something here, if we want to really understand what we are doing, let's come back on which method are we taking for all of these 3 works I've seen so far that could give a framework about, now if we distillate that against this view, what does it mean then for the regulation part, the economic part, and so on, and the human part? So you could have a model to reframe that and reposition your work in a systematic approach across your work. Then as well, you can ask yourself, is this valid? Is this good? Is this so other people or the communities could look at it from an ethics perspective, from an anthropologic perspective, and say, actually, in French, we call that la fausse bonne idée, the false good idea. It looks like a great idea when we start as good distributed and so on. And we don't think about this river of unconscious behind us about all of these layers. Because we think as, I am who I am, 54 years old, male, white, blah, blah, blah. And maybe somebody would have a very different idea. So my message here is, I think it's a great work, but perhaps we could help each other with finding the right framework on the other side, which is not the protocol piece, but the design piece.
Of course. Thank you.
So Colin and Britta, I did close the queue behind Arnaud, but I'm happy to accommodate you. No? I'm happy to accommodate you if you can be short.
I will be very short, I think. Colin Perkins, Licia said the protocols haven't changed, and therefore that's a sign that we can't predict perhaps whether the protocols will drive centralization or not. That may be true. It may also be true that the requirements have changed or the environment has changed and the protocol is no longer fit for purpose.
Yeah, we'll take that discussion online.
Britta Hale, I'll be very short as well. Thank you for this. You mentioned before about basically the trust on first use model. And although that's very usable, there's also a huge judgment when we look at this from an adversarial side. And really, when we're talking about this space, we're trying to talk about improvements on both the usability and the security, or at least maintaining the security while doing that.
Correct.
And I would just add a caveat as we go down this route, is we aren't focusing strictly on the usability improvements, that we don't drop all the lessons learned that we have on the security side.
No, you're absolutely right about this. No, I don't really have a comment on this. Thank you.
I think we need to move on to the next presentation now. Yeah.
Okay, hello. We're going to talk about power of attorneys here in digital form. Here's Sri Lakshmi. She's going to run most of the presentation. I'm Olof, and we are from Luleå University in Sweden. So traditionally, all of you know about power of attorneys. There are legal documents that are used to delegate privileges to someone we trust. People do this. And there is a secondary party that legally acquires some ownership and rights as the primary person specified and regulated by the POA. So here we're going to use this idea in a digital standpoint so that it can be used in situations where a user needs to use a trusted device, for example, or a trusted entity to work on her behalf for some time. So next. Sorry. So first, a little bit about positioning and motivation here. So we propose this power of attorney-based authorization, and the second bullet here is important. It's really to authorize entities, for example, semi-autonomous devices, or it could be non-physical entities too. But the important thing here is they have an identity. That's the whole point. You can't use POA unless you have an identity for the other party. So we are looking at fairly powerful things here. They're called agents, and they can then act on behalf of the resource owner for some time. And they're called the principal here, the one that is signing. So we're using like public key signatures here, so that POA is signed by the principal and using the public key of the agent so that it can use it later. Okay. We have some examples that we're going to talk about, like onboarding, for example, in a scalable way, where you can delegate onboarding privileges to others, right? The outline of the presentation, we just go ahead and present it now first, because there's so much complementary technologies and state-of-the-art like OAuth and other things that will be caught up if we're starting with comparison. So we do that at the end, okay? So we just steam ahead. Next, please. So there are some essential properties that makes this different from most of what you have seen. The first one, it's first of all self-contained. The POA is completely self-contained and decentralized, like PGP originally. However, we can have it supported by an optionally signatory registry that can store POAs and sign them to increase credibility. There is also separation in time. This is really important. So you can sign a POA today, and your agent can act upon this next day or next week or next month. The POA will expire at some point in time. It's written into it. And also the principal may not be online or available when the agent executes on the POA. So this is clearly different from like single sign-on, or when you delegate to like a browser app or something while you're online yourself. Okay, so we're in a different domain here. We also enable multi-level sub-granting. So I can, for example, give you a general POA that you can onboard devices to my network. And then you can provide POAs to your devices, and they come one by one. Show the general POA and the specific POA that is more restricted, of course. Or you could delegate all your credentials, right? So the POA includes detailed credentials and expiration time, and could contain additional integrity info. For example, hash of the hardware, hash of the software, if you want to ensure that the POA is valid only if this guy hasn't changed. All right. So that's the beginning.
Yep. Thank you, Lo. This is the basic idea of what is power of attorney-based authorization. So we have these three entities. The first one is the principal, and this agent, and the resource server. The principal is the one who generates the POA, and then he or she can send it to the agent. The agent is the device, which can be a cyber physical system, as Ulo mentioned. It can be a semi-autonomous or autonomous device. And we have the resource server. So the POA, which is generated by the principal and transferred to the agent now can use the POA to act or to work on behalf of the principal. And it's also time limited. So after a certain time, it gets expired. We also have the signatory registry, which is nothing but a database that you can use to store metadata or POA, which is an optional thing. So the basic idea is the agent now can work on behalf of the principal using this POA. Next slide, please. Yep. So this is our approach to use POA for onboarding, device onboarding. So we actually establish a trust chain between the different entities in the onboarding process, which are the subcontractor, which is nothing but the owner of the device. And we have the device, and then the network, the target network onboarding controller. So we establish a trust between these three entities. So in order to do that, how do we do this? So this is done by the POA. So we send a POA between the onboarding controller, which is the target network onboarding controller, and the subcontractor, and another one which is generated by the subcontractor for the device. So it's from the subcontractor to the device. So these are the two POAs that we use for this use case onboarding, device onboarding. And these are the different properties, or with this we can achieve more administrative level scalability and security, and also the time limited thing that I explained before. And also the credentials can also be passed through the POA, and law management overhead. And also we have to, the ownership of the device. It may or may not be a transfer from one person to another in this case, because the subcontractor is the owner of the device in this case. So the subcontractor doesn't really need to transfer it to another entity, another person. So yeah, next slide, please. Yep, this is the protocol flow. We have the subcontractor, and this is the onboarding component. And the first step, A and B, are the two POAs I mentioned earlier. The first one is the POA that's generated by the onboarding component that's sent to the subcontractor, so that the subcontractor right now from now on can work on behalf of the onboarding component, which is nothing but can onboard. Then after that, the subcontractor or the principal now generate another POA for the device. So after receiving that POA from the subcontractor, the device now can onboard. So step C, A and B, it's the device is sending these POA along with some other onboarding credentials to the network onboarding component. So it, as usual, it verifies everything, and it's sent to a certifying authority. And then the CA verifies and then send back a certificate. This can change according to the use case. So in this use case, yes, we have a CA, and with the certificate, along with the certificate and other network onboarding credentials, are sent to the subcontractor, the principal. Yeah, that's the protocol flow. Maybe next slide, please. Yep, this is how the PO looks like. It's we implemented it as a JSON web token. So the body have the public keys of the agent, the principal, and the resource owner, which is which can be the target network or onboarding controller. And we have that a time expiration. The important another property is the transferable. The transferable is nothing but the one that Ulo mentioned. We support multi-level authorization, which means from one agent to another agent, you can even transfer the POA so that they can also do it, do the onboarding. So that's the transferable. It's just a parameter. It's an integer. So it's like 0, 1, 2, depends on the value. You can, the number of levels it is. Yep, so next slide, please. Yeah, so we could implement it as a library, like an open source library. We have that, and also future work like we can do it as a Docker image. Or another interesting implementation is POA integration with OAuth. That we have done. Next slide, please. Yep, that's how this is how we can integrate with the OAuth. So as you can see, the principal, the agent, these are the two entities that we took from the POA part, and others are from the OAuth. So the principal, the agent is here a device, as I mentioned earlier. It can be a semi-autonomous or autonomous device, and we send the POA is only one POA in this case. That's generated by the principal and sent to the device. Yeah, so that's how we integrate. Next slide, please. Yep, that's already a done work. The future work is to implement a Docker image and also security analysis of the proposed work. Next slide, please. Was that the last one? Oh yeah. So yeah, we have a draft. It's available, and the source code for the library that I mentioned, it's also available in the GitHub. And the OAuth POA integration part, we have submitted a paper, but it's not yet published. So yeah, so that's a code for that is also available in the GitHub. So if you have any comments and questions.
Okay,
Thank
you for that presentation. I'm going to entertain people. I have 3 people in the queue so far, and I'm going to start with Lixia, but here's a reminder, please introduce yourself and your affiliation when you come to the mic.
And as the chair, I think I want to declare everyone should limit their question to be less than 2 minutes. Me being the first one, 2 questions. One is that talk about the POAs, etc. principles. What are their identifiers?
The identifiers at this point, you know, it's an early stage, so it's the public key that they're identified with. But of course, you can have a mapping between the public key and some other address, so that there is like some hashing.
We'll move that, and also in one of your later slides, you have multiple entities, how they actually authenticate each other in the first place, right? The bootstrapping question.
Yeah, we assume that there is a trust between the principal and the agent. So here.
So there's a question of how that trust gets established.
Yeah, it's mutual authentication is done via certificates. So.
Right. Who
yeah,
those certificates? Who issued those certificates?
But
I think there's a chicken egg problem there.
Yeah, it is. There is a trust chain in the beginning. For example, there is often a trust in subcontractors, basically. So that's you only give POAs to stuff that you trust.
Into 2 minutes, I just bring up those questions. My second question, which is, how do you see this work relates to the goal of this group? How this relates to centralization or mitigating centralization?
mitigating centralization. It's, of course, it's we can't guarantee that it will do it, but in the basic form, it is decentralized. If you have the lib idea where you download the source code, each party can execute the POAs individually without help of anything else, at least possibly so.
Yeah, it's like similar to PGP. That's what we are planning to.
Okay, Jens.
Yes, hi, Jens Winkhäuser. Thank you for this. This is pretty much exactly what I've been doing as well, so I think we should talk. The only question I have is, have you considered explicit revocation at this point? Because you might issue a POA and then decide, actually, that's no longer what I want to do.
Can you repeat access?
Sorry, maybe that's easier like this. Explicit revocation.
All right.
Okay, yeah. Yes. This POA, it's time limited. So after certain time, it get expired, and so it's basically the principal who generates the POA and decide how long it need to be. For example, how long the task will take time, how long it will be. So the principal assume that one and then put that now as a number in the POA.
Yeah, that's also how I started, but you might issue a POA that's valid for a week, and in that week something happens and you no longer want to issue it. So you can't really take it back anymore once it's given out. That's why I'm saying.
No, this is a very good point, and it's a central, as long as you're decentralized, it's the same with public keys, right? How do you revoke them? Make sure that it doesn't reside anywhere, like in the community. Yes. So actually adding some centralization there, like the repository, could help in revocation. But
thank you.
Your point.
Okay, thank you, Roland.
Yeah, Roland Bliss, KIT. Same point. Revocation certificates are quite easy unless you consider revocation. That makes it much more complex, and that's just you made my point. Thanks.
Yeah, we're aware of this problem, and it has to be addressed. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And Dirk, you have the last word.
Yeah, just quickly, thanks a lot for bringing this work to DINRG. I just want to point out that you got some really good questions in the chat. So we won't have time today to answer all of those, but we recommend looking at those, and maybe we can follow up on the main list.
Will we see the questions on the chat later? Can they be saved?
We try to save them, yeah.
And we'll attempt to capture them for the notes for the meeting as well. Okay, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rick van Rijn. We've been working in a group, sometimes we call it ARPA2, sometimes we call it Internet-wide project, but we've been working on decentralization for a few years. Much of what we've done is actually already technology, and it's running code, so that's a bit concrete for a research group, but what we find when we talk to different protocol groups, always we need to tell the entire story because there's a big story behind it, and that's what we'd like to present here. Economy is one of the starting points. We also had the economy of skill is definitely there, but we do have a strong belief in hosting providers because we do see people find it quite normal to pay a few euros a year or pounds, whatever, to a hosting provider and get some basic services for it. And they sometimes do that together with an email service with Gmail, for example, or with Yahoo. And although hosting providers have limited resources, I mean, they generally do just a few protocols. We believe that when they get together, they together form a very good counter voice for the few very large silos that we are having now. And what we came up with, and that's just how we see things, is open for discussion, is we believe it's helpful to take the hosting providers and consider two different roles for them, either in the same or in different parties. And one of them would be an identity provider, apologies, covering things like DNSSEC, DANE, and identity provisioning. And the other would be a service provider, and it might be a web service provider, it might be an email provider or SIP or XMPP, I don't care, but they would be plugins to each other. Thanks to open protocols, this is very well possible, and without open protocols, it's pretty much impossible. So it very much aligns with the way we do things in the IETF, I think. Next slide, please. So I basically already mentioned what we believe the two things should do. And how do you get these two together? Well, there's some technical detail like what host names are going to be used, what IP addresses need to be assigned. So the way we envision this is a service provider publishes an icon, probably an XML file that's pulled into the identity provider, which says, oh, hey, dear user, we just got a new contract for you. These are the privacy conditions. Those are the costs that are going to be charged, and so on and so on. Do you agree with all that? And if that's the case, there's some form of acknowledgement going back. And from that time on, there's a contract between the identity provider and the service provider that serves as a plugin into the DNS space. It's published with DNSSEC, DANE, TLS, all those things that are needed. And the big issue, we believe, it's been called solved. I don't think when you get to the details, authentication is completely solved. But we've been looking into how can we trust an identity from another domain given existing protocols, because that's what we get into then. You run up to a server, it might be just a plugin server, and the identity provider belonging to the same domain might be running somewhere else. There needs to be some form of a trust relationship, both when you address your own server, like your own IMAP server, for example, or when somebody else runs up maybe to your SMTP server, says, I want to authenticate before I before I can launch an email towards you. So trust basically becomes the central point. We usually take a new term so that we don't get into conflict with existing terms. So we coined the term realm crossover. And we've identified 3 technologies that cover many, if not all, not all, but most protocols, and especially the modern ones. SASL is the paramount one. It's just about anywhere. Just name a protocol and probably does it. And Kerberos has its own protocols every now and that's a bit older. Usually nowadays it's encompassed into SASL. But some protocols do require Kerberos, and we found realm crossover technologies for both. And certificates, of course, are a common facility that's being used. So I'd like to get into these 3 and how we envision that these can be used without making many changes at all. So next slide, please. Oh yeah, sorry, it's there already. So for SASL, which is pretty much everywhere already, SASL has mechanisms that you can just very easily create new mechanisms for. So we designed one that's called SXOver Plus, and what that does basically, it's an end-to-end wrapper for that encrypting end-to-end wrapper for another SASL mechanism that runs inside of that. And yeah, the best way to show this with the next slide, I think, with just a small image. So imagine a protocol client using an identity provider of his own domain and accessing a server that has never heard of that domain before. Basically, what it does is it starts an end-to-end SXOver Plus service. And the nice thing of SXOver Plus is it mentions the domain as whom the client wants to authenticate. So the foreign server can forward that message to the identity domain for the client. And basically, it starts bouncing back and forth these encrypted packets without knowing what goes on until the identity domain reports back and says, hey, I got a user ID. You know my domain name. You verified it with DNSSEC and DANE and TLS and whatever. I'm the one who can now vouch for a username underneath that domain, and here you have it. Now you have a user domain name kind of identity. And the interesting thing is SASL is flexible. It can negotiate a mechanism. So as soon as this is supported on the client and the server, it can do just about, can work for just about any protocol, given that the software also has the flexibility to take on the mechanism, of course. We didn't need to change any of the existing protocols. That's the nice thing. They are used as they are. IMAP, XMPP, no changes. So next slide, please. Oh, yeah, sorry. So what we changed is we use diameter between the foreign server and the identity provider. We only need to define 3 different address value pairs for the token, for well, a few simple things. And we needed to define this new SASL mechanism, and that was it. Since we got started, we also added SASL to HTTP. We're presenting that actually next Friday in the HTTP Biz group. It's proving to be a battle because HTTP is, well, they're afraid that browser manufacturers will feel threatened by it and that sort of thing. But I think there's many use cases where this is really useful. We have it working, by the way. We have a plugin for Firefox. It's just an independent JavaScript bit of code. And we have this working, and we have it on the server side for Apache, for Nginx. So this stuff really works. Actually, even added it to a PAM module for sudo and containers and that sort of thing. Kerberos, another story. Kerberos actually already does realm crossover. If you get a ticket, or if you ask for a ticket, you can get a reference back. And that reference basically says, oh, I don't know about the host you're asking for, the service, go and ask that one. And you continue sending your ticket request to the other server. Normally, a KDC will only do that if it has a pre-arranged key between the 2 KDCs, the client KDC and the service KDC. And all we had to do there is have the KDCs, so the realm controllers, the identity controllers for the realm, only had to make those communicate and exchange a key. Since that only means a change at the domain level, it means that the client doesn't have to change. Clients can already do this because generally they follow up on these instructions. So we define a protocol for the KDC to KDC exchange. And initially it was not safe to specify this host belongs to that Kerberos realm in DNS, but we have DNSSEC now, so we can now safely do that. So we made a draft for that as well. So basically Kerberos with dynamic realm crossover. We're actually also here talking about a TLS mode that is Kerberos together with Diffie-Hellman. Diffie-Hellman for the freshness of the secrets, and Kerberos for having something that can't be detected with a quantum computer. So the two really form a very good bond. So that's the Kerberos variant. Now, for certificates, there are two ways. Officially, LDAP is supposed to be used for storing certificates. And LDAP, given the domain, has a standard DNS SOV record where you can find it. So, and there's the format of searching for the objects for a certain user under a given domain are also pretty much standardized. So it's quite clear how you can look for an identity there. X509 certificates as well as PGP keys can be stored in there under your own domain name, under your own control, or at least at your own identity provider, the guy you're paying for doing it properly, the way you want it done. And I think most people now using the silos have given up on privacy on account of apathy, can't do anything else, don't know what to do. I think it's important to have other options, and this is one of them. Something else we're going to talk to during this conference, I think, is in the dance group, which does Client Dane. I'm a modern dancer, so I very much look forward to going there. But Client Dane could also just have a root CA for a given domain, announce it under DNSSEC security, and basically state whatever this thing signs is going to be a valid client underneath this domain. So that will be yet another way of assuring the security of the client identity. I think it was my slide. Yeah, there's many more slides because, as I said, we have specifications, we have a blog actually, and a lot of code. So there's plenty to play around with. It's beta sort of level. But you're quite welcome to play with it and feedback whatever you want to share about it. And plus, this is sponsored by the NGI Pointer Project as well as NLNet. The European Union likes this kind of direction because it's very much in line with the GDPR and the privacy consideration that the European Union has. Maybe there's also something political, like we don't want to hand over all control to America. I don't know about that, but the European Union definitely likes this line of work. Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Okay, thank you. There are other slides. So when you download this presentation from the research group meeting materials, you'll see the other slides. So thank you for that. Questions, comments? Okay.
I do have a question, but I think in the discussion has to go on to the mailing list now. I didn't figure out exactly how this cross-realm trust relation get established. But we'll have to defer that discussion because we have. Okay. Yeah. That's just my question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I turn it over to you. I can control the slides and you just tell me.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Okay, yeah. This was a pretty interesting meeting so far with many diverse topics, and I think it kind of nicely reflects like the broad spectrum that we have in the group. And so I'm not sure you noticed, but the charter text that we have on the DINRG data tracker site is a little bit outdated, and so we thought now could be a good time to revise this and say better formulate what we actually want to get out of this group, what could be say outcomes, what could be good ways of working, and this is what we want to get out of this discussion now. So so Lisha and I have thought a little bit about this, but so of course we didn't want to preclude too many things. So this is just a discussion starter, and we hope to get some feedback today and during the week, and then also at this side meeting on Wednesday that Disha mentioned. Yeah, next slide, please. Right, so the current DINRG charter was developed several years ago when there was lots of interest in, say, decentralization technologies specifically. And so it covers a really broad spectrum, including, decentralized apps and all these things. And over time, I think we all gained a bit better understanding. So what could be useful contributions in this IETF, IRTF environment? What are really the pressing issues? So I think we learned this really well also through these workshops that we had. So this last year workshop, for example, if you haven't seen the report, I highly recommend checking that out. And so we had seen, like, also today, right, the different types of presentations. So now people talking about the problem analysis, right? So how can centralization be characterized? How can it be measured? Perhaps we also had this, but then also say some more architectural thoughts. So what could be, say, technical reasons? Of course, we know that there are many economical reasons, as we also discussed today. But then sometimes we also, like today, we get interesting proposals that fall into this topic. And so we thought, okay, let's think a bit about how could we structure this work. Next slide, please. So maybe first of all, we should probably talk a bit about the objectives that we see. And so now, clearly, just take this as some initial thoughts, and we should definitely talk more about this. And I'm sure people in the room and people in the online meeting here have additional ideas. So what Lisha mentioned earlier is that I think we are in a really good position here, and we have a really good opportunity to make DINRG the place in the, say, Internet IETF community where we would discuss Internet centralization and the corresponding problems and threats, but potentially also do something about it. But I mean, first of all, as we have also seen today, there's still lots of interest and also need, we assume, in analyzing things further and pointing out the problems further and so on. And so we think that should definitely continue, and we should keep on going, basically. And perhaps trying to formulate some intended outputs. So like, what could be these useful insights? So what could be useful recommendations, and maybe also what could be technology components that we may be able to offer in the end. So, so for doing this, we think we should continue, like, for example, talking about measurements and analytical work on the existing internet. And then also create this base of knowledge and explore technical solutions for, say, doing things differently, so facilitating decentralized system development. And so one question is also a little bit, what is the audience of our work, or what are the consumers of our great ideas? And I mean, so firstly, of course, we are in the internet IETF community, so we assume that we could make useful contributions here. But then in this particular topic, there's also the question, could other bodies, other actors somehow pick this up and learn something from our work? So we are thinking about basically providing input for regulators, for example. So not in terms of telling them what to do, but say giving them, say, better information, maybe also explaining better technical alternatives to certain aspects of so topics that we have seen today, for example. And so this was our first list of objectives that we came up with. And then next slide, please. We thought, okay, maybe we could, just to explain better what we are doing, and also maybe structuring the activities a bit, say, assume we have like two main strengths in our work. So like maybe one is more analytical, so characterizing centralization, assessing it, and so on, and also the consequences that are associated. And then maybe a second strand would be then more on, say, the exploration of decentralized systems, application design. And so here, of course, we also had this discussion, I think, today in the chat. I saw that. So what do we actually mean by that? So that clearly needs to be, so we would have to explain this better in a complete charter. And so we think decentralization is a lot about decentralizing control power. So we have decentralized systems that are technically decentralized, but not from a control power perspective. And this seems to be the main issue. And so we would, so for the charter discussion, we need to clarify this. But from a topic perspective, yeah, we think that this could host like experimental solutions, experimental work, maybe also some, say, continuous work, say, developing something like a specification if we find like a particular technology that's really important. And but also, yeah, having a bit this space where we can exchange ideas for developing future elements of the internet, but perhaps not only the internet, but also the web. So I think we should also be able to discuss this in this group here. And I think you have another slide, if you can just, right. And so what we thought is, okay, we could, of course, develop this list of objectives, but then generally structure the work around these two strands. And so, of course, we need to identify like more specific topics for continuous work. I don't think this should be defined top down. So we are seeing many good ideas, and this needs to be a community-driven thing, and we need to eventually identify things that we deem important enough or interesting enough. And yeah, so we would certainly continue like inviting relevant research presentations like today, like that just open up new horizons or just give us new ideas that could help us identifying future work. And for our meetings like today, I was mentioned 3 strands there, but so, I mean, we can be fairly flexible how we run it. So sometimes we may have like workshops that focus on one very particular topic. Other days like today, when we have more time, we could, accommodate very different types of work. For the charter discussion, and maybe also, yeah, in general for planning the future work better, we think it would also be good if we could identify research communities and relevant groups we'd like to work with. And so here we are also hoping a bit to get more suggestions from the group. Also, so not only in terms of topics, but also co-locating meetings. So I think that's something we definitely want to do. So meeting also outside the IETF, IETF cycles. And so this is what we had prepared so far. So we deliberately kept it on this level and didn't think it's worthwhile to discuss lengthy charter text at this point. And so now we'd like to open the floor for comments, feedback, better ideas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dirk. I'd like to open up the floor for questions or comments about this. I'm going to be rude and insert myself in the queue. Okay, and Lixia wants to go too, the folks in the front of the room. I'll take the prerogative of controlling the slides here for a moment.
Yeah.
You asked a couple of questions here in terms of objectives, and I just want to make 3 very quick comments. The first was you asked about the audience for the work that comes out of DINRG, and I think it's possible that the entire community can benefit from the work that's going on here. And by that, I mean that some of the work that comes out of DINRG can inform work that goes on in the IETF. But I also think that some of the work that's going on here can inform work that's going on in the IAB. So I think that there's actually, the audience is quite broad for the work that's going on here. You said, Dirk, you said something really interesting in your slides about measurement. And in fact, it appears on this slide, and then measurement appears on this slide as well in the second bullet. And I think one of the things that's important to us is making sure that we focus and clearly define the kinds of measurement work that we would be doing, because we already have a research group that does focus on measurement, MapRG, and we don't want to duplicate that work. I think that's really important. My third comment is about your last slide. I think the 2 strands are pretty interesting, and while I'm very interested in centralization and the effects that it has on the internet and on the internet ecosystem, I think the measurement part is just as important. And so I'm going to, on the mailing list, I'm going to make suggestions around that. I promised that I would only have 3 comments, but my fourth comment is that anyone who has been interested in this has taken a look at the DINRG charter, and you'll find that it's very long. It's
right.
One of the longest charters I've ever seen. And I think some editing needs to go on there and focused on, like you've said in your 3rd slide, on the objectives. So that's just one person comments. I'm going to go to Lixia, then Mallory, then Arnaud. Lixia, you're next.
Okay, I think everyone need to limit the comments. I'll do myself 2 minutes. First of all, you mentioned about input into IAB. That's actually exactly what I wrote down there. I think that we should develop topics for future workshops, and there could be potential suggestions to IB workshops. This is a very important problem area. My second thing is regarding the measurement. I think the measurement research group is perhaps more into the methodologies of measurement. And for this group, fundamentally, we want to decide what we want to measure to demonstrate the factual things about centralization. What have been centralized? How much has been centralized? We need those kind of hard evidence as a potential input into the future regulations, policy makers. Because, like I mentioned earlier in the talk, that personally, I do not believe technical solutions alone can completely address the centralization problem, which has economy of scale as a big factor, as a big driving force. My third thing, adding into the charter revision, is that this group should produce documentations helping the entire community to fully understand, the problem space. Like, for example, Mark's taxonomy, I think, is a great starting point to define the terminologies, categorize the centralizations in the different subdomains, whatever, so that we have the responsibility to actually articulate and clarify the entire problem space. Not like currently, I think we have a broad feeling that internet gets centralized. I think we need to go more qualitative and quantitative as well.
Okay, Mallory, let me let you have the microphone, and then Arnaud after you. You have to push Arnaud out of the way is what you have to do.
Sorry, Mallory. I thought you were on the remote.
I am, both. Hey, everybody. Mallory Nodal from the Center for Democracy and Technology. So I actually remember the first time I came to one of your meetings. It was in London, and it was however many years ago that was, what, 2018? And at the time, I was super interested in it because I knew folks from UCL who came with their work around distributed ledger technology, and I was, working with someone there at the time, and I think we all thought maybe then that the distributed ledger technology and the blockchain and all that was going to solve a lot of interesting problems, or at least attempt to. I would be proud to call myself a skeptic even back then. But I wonder how much of this major, and I would call this like a major shift in charter and mandate, has to do with two things. One is the word distributed is very ambiguous. It's been used in a lot of different ways. People are constantly confused about what we mean when we say it. And then two, the second trend is that, well, like the blockchain stuff didn't really work out to be all of that super interesting. There's still a lot of interesting work. I don't want to knock it down, but I think there was a lot of promise then that this would be a really rich space for the IETF and the IRTF in particular to research. And we're not seeing maybe as much of that. And so I think those two trends mean that there's been a lot of charter creep. And I just wish there were, I would ask, maybe this is a request instead of just ranting about it, maybe ask for folks who've been involved in this work a lot more consistently than I have been, to connect the dots a little bit more explicitly between blockchain stuff and solving consolidation and competition and centralization of the internet, because those are really, there's a bunch of space in between those things for me still.
I think in terms of documentation development, we should have at least one documentation to articulate exactly the point. I mean, the problem, the question you raised.
Okay, Arnaud, quickly, my friend.
Yep, very quick. In fact, it's very strange. For the first time, Mallory, we agree on something. So I have the same issue. Yeah, I think there is a methodology issue between connecting the dots, and I would urge that you don't have two problems to resolve quickly, like measurement and the other one, but you need to have a methodology that assumes if you would have enough analytics and they would be good, and if you would have enough data on a number of things, how does it connect to centralization? So again, my point is that maybe you could look at another part which is not here, which is the design issue. how does design influences up to the other societal issues you have, including the centralization piece. And go in, frankly speaking, go in other areas than our area, because I don't think we in IT, telecom, and so on are going to give the answer. In history, you can see a number of things in other societies in the 20th century where people tried things on the real good intention and it failed because they didn't realize what it would create at the upper level. So go back to design, look at what is the theory of design, look at how it is influencing up to society, legal, ethics, anthropology, society, and so on. And you will find many examples. And this could help you to, this is how we connect the dots. And then you can put all the materials you want to attach to that methodology. That's my feedback. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Colin?
Hi, Colin Perkins. I think there's a bunch of really nice ideas here. And I think there's a basis for a really nice restructuring of the charter here. What strikes me is that the way this is written reads like some internet measurement protocol people wrote it. And I suppose that makes sense since you are internet measurement protocol people. There's not perhaps as much focus on economics or societal issues and understanding those aspects as the problem domain might require. So I think there's a really nice start here, but I'd encourage you to think perhaps a little bit more broadly.
Okay, that's
okay.
very helpful. Perhaps let me just get Dirk to intervene here on what the next steps are. I assume the discussion will move to the mailing list.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks a lot, everybody. This was really good feedback, and the points are really taken. So also I understood Mallory's points and Colin's points. So that was exactly the plan. So we just put this out now to get this kind of feedback, and responding to Colin also is especially on the more constructive elements of the work. And I mean, we're not in a rush here, right? So we can really take time, discuss this in a orderly way, and then get out something that is really really useful. So what we are going to do now is collect the feedback today and analyze it, and follow up on it for this Wednesday meeting. And so we hope that make the next more concrete proposal of this. And we hope that many of you can make it to that meeting, and then let's just continue working on this. Thank you very much. It was a great meeting. Thanks everybody for bringing their work and for the really good discussion also in the chat. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
I should have given you context at the start. At the end of this. It's I've got an off-agenda meeting and I'm not sure it's I'm not planning on it. It's like too much. I lose too much time. So that's the day. Like on Wednesday for lunch, like 12 o'clock. Shall we say that? Yep. I'll see you then.
Thank you.